Since the 18th century, scholars have noted that the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are alike in a way that the Gospel of John is not. Indeed, though composed at different times, there is nearly verbatim agreement among these three Gospels in a stunningly large number of passages, especially when read in the original Greek. Despite the remarkable similarities, noticeable differences remain. Similarities alone and differences alone could be explained away. For example, students who have never actually looked at the Synoptic Gospels side by side to explore the verbal similarities are inclined to account for them based on the oft-invoked example of three people observing the same traffic accident and then being asked to give testimony in court as to what happened. It would not be surprising, they argue, to find a lot of similarities in their testimonies since they all witnessed the same event. True, but if they employ the exact same words to describe the event, a good lawyer suspects collusion. And that's precisely what you find in these first three Gospels. And so scholars refer to these three Gospels as Synoptic Gospels, from the Greek word meaning to see together, in the sense of having the same view, the same perspective or outlook. Precisely put, the problem, really more a puzzle, is that there are not only striking agreements, but significant differences among the first three Gospels. Accounting for this phenomenon is the goal of research into the origins of the first three Synoptic Gospels. But let's not speak in generalities. Let's look at the evidence. With respect to what scholars call the triple tradition, stories shared by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, scholars have noted four striking patterns of similarities. There are similarities in wording. Some of the wording of the Synoptic Gospels, especially in the sayings of Jesus recorded in the Gospels, is identical, not just similar. Compare, for example, the wording used by the Synoptic Gospels to describe Jesus' first prediction of his suffering and death, recorded in Matthew 16, 21 to 23, Mark 8, 31 to 33, and Luke 9, 21 to 22. These striking similarities are even more pronounced when read in the original Greek. Similarities in order. The Gospels, as with any narrative or story, are collections of scenes that have been cobbled together, much as you see in a movie. These individual scenes, referred to by scholars as pericope, could be arranged in any number of ways, topically, chronologically, geographically, and so on. Given that each Gospel writer could have arranged the scenes in any way they chose, it is striking that they hardly ever depart from one another in the order or sequence of the scenes in the gospel story. Similarities in parenthetical material. Sometimes storytellers will interrupt the flow of the story to step forward and address the audience directly themselves. We sometimes call this an aside. Shakespeare was notorious for his asides. It would not be very surprising to notice one gospel writer doing this from time to time, but when two do it in exactly the same scene with exactly the same words, that is noteworthy. An example is when Jesus is talking to his disciples on the Mount of Olives and telling them about the coming destruction of Jerusalem down below. He says to the disciples, "Now, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it shouldn't be, let the reader understand." See Matthew 24:15 and Mark 13:14. Notice that jolting sentence, let the reader understand. Two questions. First, who is speaking here, Jesus or the gospel writer? And second, why does the gospel writer say, let the reader understand, when Jesus is talking to his disciples? This appears to be an aside, and strikingly, both Matthew and Mark employ it in the same scene with exactly the same language. Or similarities in Old Testament quotations. Given the fact that gospel writers could have chosen any one of several ways to cite the Old Testament, they could quote the Hebrew text, the Greek translation of the Hebrew text, the Septuagint, Aramaic translations of the Hebrew text called Targums, or they could paraphrase the Old Testament themselves, either from the Hebrew or whatever translation they happen to be using. It is all the more striking that in multiple places the Synoptic Gospels quote the Old Testament in exactly or nearly exactly the same words. What is even more striking is that gospel writers will often cobble together two or more Old Testament passages from different parts of the Old Testament into a single quote. Astonishingly, when one does that, we find the others doing it too in the same place and with the same Old Testament passages. See, for example, Matthew 11:10, Mark 1:2, and Luke 7:27, where all three blend Exodus 23:20 and Malachi 3:1 into a single Old Testament quote. Three theories have been proposed to account for this evidence: oral tradition, the gospel theory, and literary interdependence. Let's look at each. First, oral tradition. Some suggest that these striking similarities can be accounted for based on oral tradition. Pre-literary societies relied on information and stories being handed down in oral form because people couldn't read. Consequently, oral transmission of stories was highly reliable in the ancient world. So the argument goes. But the oral tradition theory is not so compelling when you move it from theory to actual practice and observe the similarities at close range in the Gospels themselves. For example, Matthew and Luke both correct Mark's Greek in the same stories. In Mark 4, Mark tells the story of Jesus getting into a boat to teach the crowd gathered on the lake shore, but Mark's Greek is awkward at best, literally saying that Jesus, having embarked in a boat, sat down in the sea. Now, of course, Mark means that Jesus sat in the boat that was in the sea, but that is not what his Greek says. Matthew and Luke, both noticing the problem, correct Mark's Greek. Now, oral tradition won't explain that. Then there is the gospel theory. Is the German for early or primitive. The theory goes that an early Aramaic gospel formed the basis for the Greek versions of the first three gospels we have today, accounting for the similarities of wording and order. The problems with this theory are two. First, the Greek gospels we have today show no signs of having been translated from Aramaic. And two, if the early gospel was Aramaic, it is highly unlikely that independent Greek translations of the Aramaic would have resulted in the staggering amount of verbal agreement we have in the Synoptics. By far, the view held by most scholars is that only some sort of direct dependence can account for the phenomenon we have in the Synoptics. The question, of course, is who is dependent upon whom? While theoretically no less than 18 possible relationships could exist among the synoptics, scholars have settled on 4. The first theory is the Augustinian Hypothesis. Augustine of Hippo proposed that the canonical order, Matthew, Mark, Luke, is the order of composition as well. That is, Matthew wrote first, followed by Mark, who used Matthew, and finally by Luke, who used both Matthew and Mark. Hence, the order of composition would be Matthew, Mark, Luke. The second theory is the Griesbach or two-gospel hypothesis. This is the view first proposed by Johann Griesbach in the 18th century, that Matthew wrote first, followed by Luke, who used Matthew, accounting for the similarities between Matthew and Luke, followed by Mark, who used both Matthew and Luke, abridging them, or abbreviating them, hence the two gospel hypothesis. On this theory, the order of composition would be Matthew, Luke, and then Mark. Next comes the two-source hypothesis. This is the view first proposed by H.J. Holtzmann that Mark was used as a source independently by both Matthew and Luke. While this accounts for the bulk of the similar material between Matthew and Luke, it does not account for the 230 verses that Matthew and Luke share that are not found in Mark. For this, Holtzmann put forward the idea of Q, a separate source from the German word Quelle, meaning source, which was used independently by both Matthew and Luke, but was not used by Mark. Hence the two-source hypothesis, consisting of Mark and Q. The order of composition would be Mark, Matthew, followed by Luke. Later, B.H. Streeter accepted Holtzmann's hypothesis, but further refined it by proposing a four-source hypothesis, in which Mark was used as a source for both Matthew and Luke. Matthew and Luke independently used Q, and then Matthew added some of his own unique material, for example, the parable of the sheep and the goats, which Streeter calls M for Matthew, and Luke added some unique material of his own, such as the parable of the prodigal son, which Streeter calls L for Luke. Thus, according to Streeter, four sources lie behind our synoptic gospels: Mark, Q, M, and L. Finally, the Ferrer hypothesis. The existence of Q has always been problematic for scholars, at least in part because no one has ever seen Q. It's a theory, not a document. Scholars posit its existence out of circumstantial necessity, but until some archaeologist actually finds a document like Q, the two-source hypothesis will always be questioned by some scholars. Of course, if we can account for the 230 verses of similarity between Matthew and Luke without appealing to a hypothetical source like Q, there would be no need for a Q. Austin Ferrer has proposed just such a solution. He says that Mark was the first gospel, acknowledging the overwhelming evidence for Markan priority, which we will explore next, followed by Matthew, who used Mark, and then Luke, who used both Mark and Matthew, thereby obviating the need for a Q document. Now, of course, the primary problem with this theory is that if Luke used Matthew, then why are the two Gospels so different? On the Ferrer hypothesis, the order of composition would be Mark, Matthew, and then Luke. Of course, most, though not all, theories of literary interdependence rely on Markan priority. That is, that Mark was composed first and was used as a source for the other two Gospels. And so we need to explore a bit further the case for Markan priority. First of all, there is agreement in order. The Markan order of events is followed both by Matthew and Luke, with Matthew and Luke nowhere agreeing together against the Markan order. Then there is Markan verbosity. While Mark is, to be sure, the shortest gospel, his description of events is nearly always longer and fuller than either Matthew's or Luke's. If Mark is dependent on Simon Peter's eyewitness report of events, as tradition asserts, that might explain why Matthew and Luke felt free to abridge Mark's description, but not to elaborate on them. Then there is Mark's Greek. Mark regularly uses Greek grammar and syntax that is rough, often clumsy, which may be the result of Greek being a second language for Mark. In any case, Matthew and Luke regularly smooth out Mark's rough Greek. Then there is evidence of theological reworking. One example, in Mark chapter 10, verse 18, Mark has Jesus say, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God." Matthew, who sees this as having potential for misunderstanding, changes it to, "Why do you ask me about what is good? There is one who is good." Problem solved. Then there are Aramaic expressions. Mark employs Aramaic expressions in his gospel, which Matthew and Luke eliminate, pointing to the early character of Mark's gospel and perhaps the fact that he spoke Aramaic as his first language. And then finally, Mark hasn't a Q. If Mark had Q, which he would had he had either Matthew or Luke as a source, and which included such things as the nativity stories and the Sermon on the Mount and the Lord's Prayer, why on earth would he have eliminated those things from his gospel? All this evidence is believed by advocates of Markan priority to argue for Mark having been the first gospel and a source for the other two synoptics. In conclusion, while the two-source hypothesis, with its tenet of Markan priority, continues to be the theory for explaining the synoptic problem best supported by modern scholars, the Ferrer hypothesis is gaining ground because it has in its favor that it too acknowledges the overwhelming case for Markan priority, but unlike the two-source hypothesis, has the advantage of not requiring a hypothetical source such as Q. Until next time, take care. God bless.